Hi, I'm Dr. Jenna Breckenridge. I am a lecturer in health sciences at the University of Dundee. I have a clinical academic role, so I'm 50% also embedded in the local NHS Tayside, as the lead for allied health professions research, where I support AHPs to engage with both doing and using research in practice. I'm also the co-founder and moderator of @AHP Two-Min Talks, which is a global Twitter community for sharing research knowledge amongst AHPs.
Lovely. Thank you, Jenna. Gita, if you could tell us about yourself, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gita Ramdhari. I'm a physiotherapist by profession, and I completed my PhD in 2008. It's quite a long time ago now. And so my career has gone flip-flop from clinical into academia, and now I do a little bit of both. I'm a consultant allied health professional at University College London Hospital Trust in London, and I'm also an honorary associate professor at UCL at the Institute of Neurology. I'm the principal investigator and sort of lead for the neuromuscular rehabilitation research group, and supervise a number of PhD students and run my grants through that group. So I'm employed fully by the NHS, so I have to find other funding to be able to do for my research time, but we and currently supported by our Biomedical Research Centre at UCL and UCLH, and I've been doing this for a long time, so hopefully you can share some of that experience.
Thank you, Gita. And Lydia?
Hello, everyone. I'm also a physiotherapist by profession. I spent the last 10 years after I graduated from Greece. I spent doing clinical work both in the NHS and independently, and I've also worked in research. And since October 2020, I started my PhD in Cambridge at the Department of Public Health and Primary Care. And I don't have as much experience as Gita, but I hope that I can share some of my experience as a PhD student and as a clinician working in the NHS. So yeah, very happy to be here.
Lovely, thank you, Lydia. And last but not least, Rich.
Hello, my name's Richard Collings. I'm a podiatrist working down in deepest, darkest Devon, way down in the Southwest Peninsula. And I finished my PhD in June of this year. I love work. I love going to work. I love challenging the boundaries, and clinical academic research is something that lets me do that. I'm co-champion for a research champion for the Southwest, because I really believe that this is a one way that we can help to develop patient care, but ourselves. And so I'm really keen. I'm really proud to be a part of this panel today.
Brilliant, thank you, Richard. So we'll get cracking. We've got some questions prepared, and if you've got any other questions, please do pop them in the chat, and we'll try and field them. So I'll start off a question for you, Gita. Really, knowing you as I do, so we know each other, but knowing you as I do, Gita, and about how much you champion for equity and diversity, certainly across our membership, but across research. What advice do you have for aspiring clinical researchers, so those that are thinking about joining, starting their research career or are in their early career research stages, but especially those from underrepresented groups? Yeah,
there is a sea change, and I think this is a good time now, because there's been the realization that actually there are certain groups of people who have not been represented in research. And certainly, you know, we look in the universities, we look at people in senior positions, there's fewer women, there's fewer people from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. But I think, and a lot of the research councils are now publishing data on who's getting research fellowships and projects. So we're seeing these imbalances and these disparities. And I think what that has done is that it's put it acutely in focus. And so there are some opportunities now available that are coming up, because it's not about giving unearned advantage to people from minoritized backgrounds. It's actually leveling up the playing field for people who've found the doors closed or reached the glass ceilings in the past. I sit on the panel for the NIHR clinical doctoral fellowships. And it's something that I've brought up on those panel meetings, not just about how we engage with minoritized groups who are participating in the research, but about the fellows themselves. And we've got a series of meetings coming up about that. But if you look around, the Council of Deans, for example, have just they're just advertising some fellowships for people and encouraging people from minoritized backgrounds to apply. So that's not just to do with race; it's also to do with gender, LGBTQI plus, people who may have felt that they didn't belong in those spaces. And let me tell you, it's been a battle, but you belong in those spaces. And there may only at the moment be a few of us in those spaces who might look like you or have a similar lived experience, but we're fighting so that we can get more of you to join us.
That's a brilliant opening to this. Thank you, Gita. But I was also wondering, I didn't want to add to the question because it was long enough as it was, but also from some of us sitting at the other side of the table as managers, supervisors, or kind of decision makers, what should we be doing, or what can we do to also help with this levelling up as well?
I think it's about us all reflecting on who we're inviting to apply, who we're facilitating to apply, who are we letting know about these things? Because I think over the years, and I know I've done it myself, I will put my hand up in the air and say I've made mistakes in the past, and maybe really thought about, are we trying to grow teams of people who are just like us? Actually, and we mustn't do that, because not only is it not fair, it also actually really stifles the creativity of a research team and a research group. You know, we really foster creativity when we all have a different perspective and different experience. Sometimes a bit of challenge comes with that, but that's how we grow. So I think taking a really honest look at the teams that you're facilitating, look back at the last few people who you've helped to leg up with something. What were they like? Were they like you? Or were they somebody quite different? We've got to think about where our unconscious bias comes in here. So there is a responsibility for all of us to really examine not only us as individuals, but the teams we may be leading or the departments we may be managing, and get a feel for what the culture of that department is. It's something I talk about quite a lot in the physiotherapy profession. It's about the culture of institutions, the culture of professions, just to make sure that we're not keeping the status quo going, because that doesn't help anyone. We all lose out.
Brilliant, thank you. Has anyone got anything they'd like to add to that, or? Otherwise, Lydia, I'll come to you because we talk about those kind of aspiring or coming on in their early stages of their career. And I suppose I wanted to ask you, you said you're just starting kind of your PhD up at Cambridge. If you could give us a bit of an insight into why you wanted to become a clinical researcher and why you decided to kind of start your PhD.
Yes, I think as clinicians, I think it starts with that. As clinicians, we always sort of strive to offer the best care and the evidence of what we do to improve the quality of people that we work with, both in the short term and long term. And I think being involved in research as a clinician, I think that is extremely powerful. But I think personally, I started very much from being a student to then go into research without having the clinical background. And I just realized that it's actually equally important to have that clinical experience when you're doing research. I think it brings the best from both worlds, and both in terms of as a clinician being involved in research, you bring the evidence into what you do in the level of inquiry, in a day-to-day sort of relationship with your patient, but also as a researcher being involved with or having experience working in clinics and with patients, you bring that patient-certain approach in what we do in research. I think is very, very important, just to keep that clinical relevance in your research questions and the way you go about your research, from starting from things like, you know, when you're writing your methods and when you're writing a participant information sheets, make sure that people can understand what you're trying to achieve. But also when you're running your assessments or the outcome measures that you use, make sure that those outcome measures that you use are relevant to the patient. So I think that offers a huge sort of insight, and they inform each other so well. And I think they bring the best out of both roles. And I think that's the main reason why I wanted to be involved. And I think having worked in both those professions separately, I think it's best when you can combine, and what Gita is actually doing at the moment, I think it's excellent, because you can inform both professions and get the best out of them, and benefits everyone, especially the patient, but also as a clinician. I think it gives you that passion that Richard was talking about in the beginning, and making sure that you are actually also getting the best from you, like as a person, as a clinician. You want to have that career pathway. You want to make sure that you're exploring all the other opportunities around you, not just going into one single sort of path. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I suppose that brings me on to my really nice actually, where you're talking about the being able to combine the research and the clinical, and thinking about patients and outcomes, and how one can how they both feed into the other, kind of the clinical presentation, but also your interests and how you can improve services. Richard, I suppose I've got a question for you that feeds off of that, I suppose, is how do you think that your research activity has helped shape your service and the activities of your team, and the skills and knowledge across your team?
Massively, really, and in two different ways, both directly and indirectly. So directly, a really good example is that we managed to create a new podiatry post based on some of the ideas from my research, and so therefore you can look at the broader area of service development, and it's exciting to actually see some of your own individual work being translated and implemented in practice, and patients benefiting from it, which is really very exciting. But what I didn't realize is the indirect effects about the team around you. And suddenly you start to see your colleagues starting to get passion around research and innovation. And you can see the ideas starting to come from them. And they start to ask questions about the care they're providing. And is it relevant? Is it right? Well, what can we do about it? And then suddenly you start to see the culture in your own team start to change, and the quality of care that you provide to patients starts to really improve. And that to me is what I didn't realize, and what really I thrive on now, is seeing my colleagues around us. And we've got a very small team of podiatrists down in Torbay, but we've now got 3 on the beginnings of the clinical academic pathway, doing pre-docs, ready to do their doctoral fellowships, and that's really exciting, because they've all got very niche areas, but patients will benefit from this. And then of course it starts to snowball across the organization and by profession. So yeah, the indirect and direct ways, I believe, where my research has made quite a big difference.
Fantastic, and I see everyone smiling and nodding along in the background as well. I think it's something that resonates with all of us, is that kind of infectiousness of people doing research and being able to empower and impart knowledge on others, and also then be able to kind of help people on their career pathway. And I suppose, would anyone else like to chip in, or at that point have got anything else they'd like to add, or otherwise I'll come to you, Adele, and I'd say kind of with you going into your research career and pursuing your PhD, I suppose what were the drivers for that for you, but also what were, I suppose, some of the challenges and the difficulties, and how you went about pursuing your research within your clinical role?
Yeah, so I suppose following on from what Richard was saying, really, is that for me, it was operating department practitioners are a relatively small profession in comparison to other AHP professions, and they're the newest AHP profession as well. And there's very little research around operating department practitioners, so therefore there's huge gaps in the literature. But for me, it was about ultimately enhancing patient safety as well. So how can our research not only develop and enhance operating department practitioners as researchers and professionals, but actually how can that then impact on patient safety? And again, I think for me, to encourage people to role model those behaviours, similar to what Richard was saying, in terms of being a real role model for other people. So once somebody sees you doing something, then they get a bit curious and they want to engage, and they want to then kind of come on that journey with you. So for me, it's not all about everybody doing a doctorate and everybody, but it's about actually people just dipping their toe into the research pond, really, and actually just getting enthused about research. And for me, I think, if you're passionate, if you're enthusiastic, and that will drive that motivation to go on and do that research, whether that's part of a team as you're starting off, or whether that's part of leading that team. So that's kind of, they're the things that drove me really to start doing my PhD, to start doing my research. And as you say, I've been doing this whilst being clinical in the NHS, as many of others, but I'm full-time clinical leader in the NHS. And there are challenges, and you know, we've just lived through 18 months at least of a pandemic. And I think it's about, so whilst there's not many positives come out of the pandemic, one of the positives for me that's come out of the pandemic is because you couldn't go on holiday, you couldn't go to social events. So all of a sudden I was kind of thinking, oh, well, I might as well do some reading, some writing. And so all those things that, I suppose it's about changing your mindset and not seeing the things that have happened to us during the pandemic as things that we've been stopped doing, but it's actually enabled us to refocus and maybe do other things. And as I say, I think if your things, whilst things are challenging, I think if you're doing your research in areas that you're passionate about and that you're motivated to make better, I think it makes it so much easier as well. And my research is undertaken in the NHS, so I see the value of it every day. I see the difference that engaging in research and credible research actually makes a difference every day. So for me, that synergy between me being a researcher, me being a clinical, working in the clinical areas, but also being a leader in the NHS, for me, it's not something that's bolted on. And I think sometimes when we talk about research, especially in the NHS, it feels like it's bolted on rather than embedded. And for me, it's about creating that synergy between me being a researcher, embedding my research in clinical practice, and then me enabling, supporting and empowering teams to enhance patient safety. So it's about making it part of our working lives and not something that we do in addition to, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I suppose, Gita and Jenna, I'd like to ask you about your careers as well, because obviously you follow kind of the clinical can't get the words out, clinical academic routes. So I suppose I was wondering if you could give everyone some insight into kind of how you managed your career to get to a clinical academic post. How was it planned? Was it planned? And I suppose, what were the biggest supports and challenges for you along the way? Jenna, would you like to go first and then Gita come in after, if that's all right?
Yeah, so I took on my clinical academic role in 2018. So I'm an occupational therapist by background, and as an occupational therapist, very early as a student, I realised that I wanted to be involved in research. I wanted a research career. And one of the driving factors for that, I suppose, was that I got fed up of reading research articles that had their inclusion and exclusion criteria. And the exclusion criteria were that people were excluded if they couldn't communicate, if they couldn't give informed consent, if they couldn't sit down and complete a questionnaire or sit and do a verbal interview. And I thought, well, you know, here's an opportunity for occupational therapists and other AHPs to enable people to take part in research and to be involved in research as a meaningful activity in their lives. Because actually, if we don't support people, all people, to be involved in research, then we're doing them a disservice, because they're excluded from the things that research goes on to influence, such as NICE guidelines, best practice guidelines, and so on. So it's important to include everybody. So that was my motivation, and my first post actually after I graduated as an OT was as a research assistant within Occupational Therapy Service. It was a knowledge transfer partnership post. And then soon after, I embarked on my PhD, and I finished my PhD in 2010. And really, from then onwards, I've worked in research roles. And looking back, I'd like to say that it was planned that I would get to where I am. And I probably had some indication that I would have liked to have had a clinical academic role, because I think, as other people have said, there are so many benefits to having a close relationship between doing research and using research in practice. In reality, I followed my interests. I followed where the jobs were. You know, being a researcher is a fantastic career. It's so interesting, can be so varied, but it is also quite precarious. Projects are short term. Often funding is only there for maybe 18 months or so. So you're always thinking about where's the next job going to come from. So I ended up having a very diverse and varied career. I've done research in domestic abuse, in vocational rehabilitation, medical education, care homes, type 1 diabetes. I spent 8 years really post-PhD doing a lot of different research, and that I think has been the best preparation for the job that I have now. So the job I have now is to support AHPs, all of the AHP professions in NHCC side, to engage with research. So on a daily basis, I meet with AHPs who say to me, Jenna, I'm really interested in doing a piece of research about X, Y, and Z. And I have to jump into that and think, okay, so we're doing a project in orthoptics, or we're doing a project in radiography, and to try and adapt to what different professions need. And of course, different professions have got different methodological orientations, they've got different theories and knowledge bases that underpin them. So it requires quite a bit of versatility from me. So actually, I think my diverse and varied following my nose career really paved a good foundation for the type of role that I have now. And one of the things that I would say that has really benefited me, or something that I've really gained, is know-how knowledge. You know, I know how to do things. Maybe I don't have a lot of specific expertise in knowing what. You know, some people have very specialist expertise in stroke or in Parkinson's or in particular conditions, whereas my expertise, I guess, is in knowing how. It's about knowing how to research, knowing how about methods and methodologies. And I suppose it's been that type of knowledge that's really led me into the job that I have now. So a mixture of serendipity, good luck, and a little bit of planning thrown in.
Right. So shall I?
Yes, please. Sorry, Gita.
Follow on that. So it is interesting, and Jenna's saying, you know, you take opportunities, and it wasn't really planned. I can definitely say that, because my first foray into research was I was a full-time clinical physio, and I did my master's, and through that master's I got to LinkedIn with some very interesting people where I was working at the time at the National Hospital Queen Square, who were full-time academics, because there you have the Institute of Neurology and the neurological hospitals sit, you know, very much intertwined. People have roles in both. With a physiotherapist who was a scientist there. And so through that master's work, he then got a fellowship and needed a research physio to work with him. So, I mean, that was serendipity, you know, that happened to be in the right place at the right time. Said, oh, I'd like to apply for that. Now, this was back in 2003, 2004. So it was before NIHR, I think, started in 2006. So it was before we sort of saw the pipelines that are there now. So that was how I stepped on and became a research physio. And while I was there, did my PhD at UCL with him, Professor John Marsden, who's now in Plymouth, but he was a great mentor for me. So I think it's also finding people who, you know, who inspire you, who sort of become your role models. For me, seeing a physio doing neuroscience was so exciting, you know, and to hear his knowledge was very, very inspiring. And then when my, as Jenna was saying, that the only downside is that was only a 3-year fellowship. So by the end of it, I'm like, oh, what do I do now? I need a job. I've got a mortgage. You know, that's when you could get mortgages back then as a physio. So it was. So then it was. That's when I then moved into. Actually, I went into higher education. That's where I met Matt. Actually, we worked at St George's University of London. I was there for about 11 years. But while I was there, my love was still doing the patient-facing research, and I kept my links with with the Institute of Neurology and Queen Square. And another professor I work with there, Professor Mary Riley, who's a neurologist. And so we applied for a grant. So I was then bought out a day a week to go and be to lead to do the day-to-day leadership of it. And we got a clinical evaluation lead, all of that, and run it basically as a small trial. When that was going on, was when I suddenly became aware of NIHR had been going for a couple of years by then, and I heard about these clinical academic fellowships, and then had postdoc fellowships, which are now the clinical lectureships. So this first round, and I was hearing about this, had a look, and thought, wow, you know what, this actually could be very good, because the beauty of those fellowships is that you can do 50% research and 50% clinical. Because I was employed at the university and teaching, I did it on a part-time basis, so stretched it out over 5 years. So I was still doing a couple of days teaching and then 3 days at Queen Square doing some clinical and some research. And what was wonderful for me as well is it was a step back into the patient facing work, which I love, and for the same reasons that have already been said, you know, that what Richard was saying, and Adele and Lydia, you know, you when you're clinical, and you can see the questions that need to be answered, and it makes it very much more relevant to patient care. So that was that opened many doors for me, actually, that fellowship, and I then was a PI on a few other grants, research for patient benefit, lots of other NHR grants, charity grants, and they start small and then they start to snowball a little bit. But I think I always knew I wanted to be back in that environment where you had this interface between the clinical practice and the academia. And it's not easy, if you're not ascending through, when you're in a small profession like ours, AHPs, we're individually small professions compared to our medical and nursing colleagues, where I think the research career, particularly in medicine, is much more visible, and it's people more frequently do their MDs and do their PhDs, etc., as part of their training, and that was more unusual for us. But the team I work with in the neuromuscular centre, so we would do a lot of work with people with muscular dystrophies and polyneuropathies, and that's my main research interest. Didn't see any reason why, you know, a consultant therapist or AHP shouldn't look the same as a consultant neurologist, in terms of that you would do your clinics, you would also do some, they just didn't see why that was any different. It was very interesting. And then so they put together this business plan, and then the job description for this consultant AHP role, which then I applied for. Of course, I was going to apply for it because it was for me, for what felt like for me was where I felt like I needed to be. And it's an extremely busy job. Because I do a lot of clinics, and I do some MDT clinics, but the opportunities that have arisen for me from that, from a research perspective and a leadership perspective, has been phenomenal. What I would say, though, I think unlike Jenna, my title isn't clinical academic. My title is consultant. But when it comes to consultant practice in AHP careers, we have the 4 pillars. So there's education, leadership, clinical excellence, and research is one of the pillars. So what I've done with my job plans and my objectives is to very much center on the not just the clinical leadership, but also the research, because I was already quite a, you know, advancing. I was a sort of a mid-career researcher by then. So that's where I am, but I do have a role there in helping to bring others along, to encourage people on the pipeline, and probably a bit less operationally than what you've described, Jenna, but still help to facilitate and inspire people and help some of the research education. And like Richard was saying, of seeing that change in culture and people, those light bulbs going, is just so rewarding to see that from some very young, bright people coming up through the department. Is just amazing and wonderful, and people want to know and expand. So that's where I am. Where I go next, I'm not sure. I've got this honorary associate professor position, so obviously my my track record must be reaching a certain level. And there are others around in London who are AHPs. So there's a colleague at Imperial, Professor Carol Alexander, who's just become an honorary professor. So I think we can reach those heights. We can certainly aim for it now, because I think there's people already start to occupy those spaces.
Lovely. And you were talking about, I suppose, looking to support what the support structures you've had and the support you can provide to others and mentorship. And I suppose, Richard, there's something I wanted to ask you about. This is the support structures that you've used and the support, I suppose, you've given to others. And what would you recommend for people to do if they're looking for support structures to help them develop their research or to increase their exposure to research? Have you got any tips or ideas of where people could look?
Yeah, I think we've already clearly heard that, you know, getting a mentor or someone just to listen and support you through it is really important. And funny enough, Gita, Professor Marsden was the one who got me into research down in Plymouth. And so therefore you find these names and these collaborators, and you'll find a superhero out there somewhere who will take faith and guide you and direct you. But there's a lot of resources out there now on the websites, and get your Google searches out for people. You know, don't be afraid of just having a look and seeing what's out there. So CAPA, the Council for Allied Health Professionals Research, they've got a most amazing website with lots of different tips on there. Getting into research, top 10 tips written by early career researchers who haven't been through all the mill but have faced all these problems. So they've written the tips for people who don't know how to get into research, or how to write an abstract, how to present at a conference. The top 10 tips, and these are the sort of things that you start to do, and taking that first step is really important, because then you will start to have conversations, and then your experience grows. So the CAPA website, and I think the link's going to be popped into the chat at some point, you know, is really important and a really good place to start. But then we've also talked today about the National Institute of Health Research. So I was really lucky to be part of the doctoral fellowship scheme, but they've got, again, a brilliant website, and it talks about the academic side, the funding streams and the support and the mentorship and the training courses available. So again, that's really good. But again, I find on the NIHR website, one of the most useful pages is talking about how to engage with patients, and engage with patients for yourself, for your research, which is so important nowadays. And they've got a host of resources about how to do that and how to engage. And if anyone wants to get into research, the first thing you need to do is talk to your patients, engage with your patients, and that is so important. So there's some really good established resources out there that you can just sit at home and read before even talking to anyone. And that's what I would say for anyone who really wants to get into that to start with.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I agree, and it's brilliant to hear so many things, kind of resounding themes through this, which are about engaging with patients, being in excellent positions to identify the clinical patterns, and making sure that we improve services for our patients out there, for our clinical populations. I suppose this leads us nicely into a question for you, Lydia, which was about kind of starting your career, so hearing about these different support structures, and finding mentors, but also considering working with patients and making sure that we've got really good targeted research questions. What advice would you have, kind of as someone starting in their research career or just embarking on their PhD? What advice have you got for someone thinking about enrolling on a PhD or starting their clinical research career? I suppose because you're living that part of it at the moment.
Yes, I am actually, definitely. Well, there's so many good points that have already been mentioned. Like just to summarize, I think starting from what Adele was saying earlier about having passion and being enthusiastic about a research topic that you really feel and you can carry it, and it can carry you, I suppose, through the 3 years of hard work through a PhD. I think when you have that passion, it really helps. And obviously the relevance that it brings, talking with what Richard was saying, and Gita and Jen, in terms of make sure that it's needed, you can improve someone's life, and it has something to offer, and you can then take that and as you working to kind of help you as well as a clinician, how is that going to then be shaping your work after that? I think after your PhD, I think, again, having the mentors and reaching out to your heroes, I think for me is one of the things that I always do. I try and send emails like Gita or Fiona Jones or Matt Liston who are here, and just asking them, but how did you do it? How can I? That's what my idea is. How can you help me? What else do I need to think about? I think it's very important. It can be quite daunting. I was quite fortunate to work with you and to know you, but I think it's quite daunting. So it's when you read papers and you read about these names, and then suddenly you're in the same room in a conference with them, it's quite kind of like, should I approach them? Should I not? And I think, yes, you should approach and you should ask, because most people are really friendly and they're really always happy. I think academics are really, really happy to like have that great email saying, I'm really enthusiastic about this. I know that you're doing so much in this area. Can you help me? I think that's very important. The people, when they're just starting to reach out and to those superheroes that Richard was saying. But I think one thing that I was going to say in terms of like, for as an advice for someone starting their PhD, especially if you or someone early in their clinical sort of as a clinical researcher, I think this is to bear in mind. For me, it was quite hard to bear in mind that it's quite different roles from being a clinician, for having set targets and having a very clear plan, and you have results by the end of your clinic. You have a 7-hour clinic, and you've achieved a lot of things by the end of it. When you're a researcher, you sit down and you've been sitting for 8 hours reading and thinking about things, and by the end of it, you might feel like, I didn't do anything. I think I spent the first 6 months of my PhD feeling very guilty that all I was doing was reading and thinking, and I'm not doing anything. Like, I kept talking to the people around me in my families. I feel really upset. I've not done anything. I haven't achieved anything. But I think that's a process, and it's very different to the clinical role. We have very much tangible sort of results by the end of it, and we feel like we've achieved something. And I think it's important that when you embark into the researcher role to spend time sitting and reading, because that's going to actually really inform your years to come and your research project, and will improve it. So yeah, I mean, I can go on and on, but I think we've covered quite really good points in terms of the mentors and reaching out and being enthusiastic and being ambitious is one of the things that my project used to be called in the beginning. When I used to talk to people, that's an ambitious project. And I used to think that was really good. Obviously, coming from Greece and translating ambitious from Greek to English, that's great. Yeah, I want to be ambitious, but I didn't realize that, ambitious within the 3 years time. So, having the big goals, but also making sure that it can be achieved within those 3 years, that within 3 years of the PhD, I think we're all very passionate in improving the service, improving the quality of our patients, but sometimes, being also a little bit realistic about what can be achieved within a PhD is also quite important.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yes, that's a great answer, Lydia. It was so nice to hear you say don't feel guilty about reading and thinking. They're the most important things. And I think that brings me really nicely onto you, Adele, was, I suppose, what surprised you when you first embarked on your research career? What were those things that when you first became a researcher that were probably different to being a clinician?
Yeah, I suppose it just carrying on from what Lydia was saying then, it really was about, I felt that reading was like the poor relation, and there was this huge focus on writing, and there was this 60,000 words, 80,000 words, all I heard about was writing when I started my thesis. And for me, it was about reading to understand and not reading to write. And I felt like I had to read something and then write about it, and you forget, and that feeling of guilt sitting there reading, and then I wasn't actually understanding what I was reading because I was sitting there thinking, I need to be writing. So it was just about taking that real step back and actually allowing you and having what talking about your research as well, telling somebody else about your research and about your methodology or about your, anything about your project demonstrates your understanding. And for me, it was, how did I articulate my understanding? So what I would find is I'd read something and I'd go away, I'd spend 8 hours a day reading something, I'd get up the next day and I'd think, no idea what I've read. And it was, how did I make sure that I understood what I read? So for me, there were little things like, we were in the middle of a pandemic, I couldn't go out and meet people. You don't always get the same online. So for me, I did things like recording myself. So I'd go for a walk or a run or something, and I'd record myself and talk about what I'd read the previous week or something like that, and play it back to myself to see if I understood it. So the little things like that about really understanding what you're reading. and that you really can't write unless you can understand what you've read. And I didn't get that message coming through all through my degree, my master's, and it took me a long time to recognise that. So there were those kind of surprises. And I think be kind to yourself as well, I think is one of the, that you can actually be kind to yourself, and you can actually have some time away from doing all this research. And I think sometimes time away and leaving things to one side and coming back with fresh eyes just opens up new ideas, new thought channels, and renews that enthusiasm and energy that you've got for your research project as well.
Lovely, thank you, Adele. And I suppose we talked about surprises, and I wondered if we could talk quickly about what the best things are. So, Jenno, I suppose what do you think are the best things about having a clinical academic role, and what opportunities has it opened up for you?
I think for me, one of the best things about having a clinical academic role is that sort of special space that you occupy in between practice and research. And you realise that there is a real need for people like me, people like Gita, people that exist in that space to help to broker relationships and to build trust and collaboration. And having spent most of my career in research, I think the research world is dominated by this concern of how do we get our research into practice? How do we get our studies into practitioners' hands, into their heads, and into what they're doing? And as a clinical academic, the thing that I've been really challenged by is to think, well, research into practice isn't a linear thing. It's not a case of research speaks and practice dutifully listens and does what it's told. Instead, it's about how do we make research useful for practice, and what does useful knowledge look like? What does useful research look like? And for me, being in that space has given me some opportunities to do some really creative things. So a couple of years ago, I did a fantastic project about how to make research useful for practice, and we brought together AHPs with creative experts from design, technology, art, creative writing, poetry, to think about how we address this issue of making research useful. And so one of the things that came out of that was at AHP Tumen Talks, which is designed by AHPs and run for AHPs. And I mention that now just because it ties into our conversations or what I've been listening to about reading papers. So the idea of that Twitter account is that people summarise the research that they've read in 2 minutes or less. And the point is trying to make things useful for practice. That's what practitioners told us in the research that they wanted. They wanted things accessible and quick. But it's also a really good way of consolidating the reading that you're doing as a researcher, as a PhD candidate. Because if you can summarise clearly and concisely what you've read in 2 minutes for somebody else, then that's a good indication that you've understood it. So for me, the best thing about the clinical academic career has been that challenge to think creatively about how we bring together practitioners and researchers and to come up with innovative ways of trying to bridge the gap. And I think for me personally, one of the best things about my research career has been challenging my own thinking. So I'm a grounded theorist. For my PhD, I used a methodology called grounded theory. And the founder of grounded theory is called Barney Glaser. And he talks about this concept of theoretical sensitivity. And that idea is that you read as widely as possible in fields that don't even seem relevant to your own. And you start to pick up really good ideas for theories, ideas, concepts that you can apply creatively in your own setting. So for me as a researcher, the appeal of that career is that you're encouraged to be critical. You're encouraged to challenge the status quo. You're encouraged to read widely. And that not only builds and extends your own personal and professional understanding, but also starts to change the culture, through questioning and through curiosity. So that for me is probably the most exciting thing about this career path.
Excellent, thank you. And I suppose I've got one last thing. I'm aware of the time, we're just overrunning. So this is a very quick question to all of you, and I'll give my answer first, which is, if you've got one top tip to offer the audience, what would it be? So I'll give you some thinking time. So I'll answer to give you a moment, and then I'll call you out as I see you around the screen. So for me, it would be don't underestimate how important reading and understanding the literature is. Make sure you take time to do it and don't feel guilty about it, because if you don't understand the literature, you can't generate really good, insightful research questions and see where the gaps are. So that would be one tip, but there's been many from today, but I'll ask Adele, as you're next on the screen next to me.
So I suppose my one tip was, if you want to get into any research, whether it's as a career or just doing some research, is don't wait for the right time, because it will never come. I think it's just go with it. Just you know, when you're feeling anxious, when you're feeling scared, channel that energy and let's just get on with it.
Awesome, thank you. Lydia.
I was just going to say very similar to what Adele was saying, and it would be, I hope it's not product placement, but my motto that I've been living, and my top tip for myself in the last year or so, is just do it. Like, don't think about it, don't question if you should or you shouldn't, if you're good or you're not good. You know, just do it and then see where that goes. And I'm sure whatever the result, you learn a lot by just doing it.
Brilliant, thank you, Lydia. Gita?
Similar vein, but I think it's grab those opportunities that present themselves. So something might pop up in your inbox, or somebody might forward an email on something that you could apply for, and rather than thinking, you know, no, I'm not sure, is actually engage with it, because actually something might spark from that, and you've got to be in it to win it. Sorry, more product placement, but it's amazing what can come from those, putting your hat in the ring and just giving it a whirl. You know, sort of my thing I always tell my PhD students is always worth a punt. And even if you don't get it, usually with these things you get feedback, and that feedback can be incredibly helpful for you to then, because once you've had given something a bit of thought, even if you don't get that time, you've probably got some feedback. You then can turn it into something else that then you can apply for.
Brilliant, thank you, Gita. And that's how I ended up living in Australia for 4 years. Jenna?
My top tip would be to build and sustain relationships. Opportunities only come through the context of relationships often, and one mentor isn't enough. You have different mentors throughout your career at different times and in different places. And actually, sometimes you don't know who your mentor is going to be. So I think build relationships, reach out to people. If you're inspired after reading someone's article, as people have already said, send them an email. People love to hear that you've read their work. Start to build relationships, because research happens with people. That's the most important, most exciting part of it. So yeah, build and sustain relationships. That's the key to success, the key to planned serendipity in your career.
Definitely, and making the most of all the opportunities that come up. And I think we will all say we've done this. We've all emailed our heroes and said that we love their work and we'd like to have a chat. And I think most of the time they email back and say, brilliant, when would you like to have that chat? So don't feel scared, don't put people on pedestals, I think is a big message here. And last but not least, Richard.
Similar vein from everyone else about taking that first step, but don't be afraid to challenge. Don't be afraid just to say, I don't think this is right, I can do better. And that would be the first step, and then everything else starts to fall into place. The next step, the next step, the next step. Don't look too far ahead, but don't be afraid to say, I'm not happy with the status quo. What can we do better? And from there, things start to happen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Adele, Lydia, Gita, Jenna, and Rich. a fantastic discussion. And I just wanted to really quickly just wrap up. I think the main take-home message from this are, if you're interested in research, just do it. Contact someone, talk to someone, find a mentor, find many mentors, not just the one. And don't feel afraid to take the jump. And if there is someone whose work you like, always contact them. That they'll really enjoy being contacted and know that someone is reading it and wants to take it on board somehow. So thank you, everyone. I'm sorry for overrunning a little bit, but I hope you've enjoyed the session.